Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying safe and washing your hands and staying healthy. Um, we're in week 2 now, and I told you that we'd have online lessons ready to go, and that's what I'm doing. So we're going to continue on with class. We're going to get some content covered. That way, you all can be ready to go into your sophomore year next year. Um, this unit is federal and state government, and we've talked about that already. Last week, you were looking at some of the roles of Congress, but also state government, county government. You just finished your Create Change projects about making change within our community, what that does. So, we've done a lot with local government, we've done a lot with state government. Now, we're going to start to look at the federal government, and I'm going to make some comparisons for you between the federal and state legislative branches as we're going through this as well. Just an FYI, there is 2 assignments in this day. So watching this video, but then there is a short comprehension check that you need to complete after you watch this video. It's 5 to 10 questions. You answer it. That way I know you watched the video, and there will be some points assigned to you for that. It will probably be around 10 questions. So make sure you fill that out. It is a quiz-ish. That's what Google calls it, but I'm just checking to make sure that you're doing okay and you're getting the information. Just a reminder, and I've sent this out on Google Classroom, I am going to have office hours from 9 to 10 every day during this NTI break. So make sure if you have a question, you get on that Zoom. That link will be consistent across each of the pages, or you can call in if you need to, and I'll be able to give you the information that you need to be successful. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and move into the legislative branch. So as we're looking at this information, the responsibilities of the legislative branch can be broken down in a few ways. Legislation is law. So if you're in the legislative branch, that means you are in the branch that makes laws. So that is the most important job of the legislative branch, is to make laws. That's true at the federal level, and that's true at the state level. Both of those levels, with their legislative branches, make laws. At the federal level, that's Congress. Congress makes laws for the country. At the state level, that's the General Assembly. We have representatives and senators that go to Frankfurt and make laws for us. That is their job. When they're making laws, they do have to balance the needs of lots of different people. First and foremost, they have to balance the needs of the nation versus their local interests. So if we look at our representative, Andy Barr, who's our representative in the House of Representatives, he has to balance what our community needs, his congressional district, versus what the country needs as a whole. And sometimes those don't align. Sometimes they actually run contrary to each other. That stuff that he needs to be for, or stuff that makes the country better, doesn't always help our community. So he has to balance those needs as he's deciding how he's going to vote on specific issues. So he does represent and his constituents. Those are the people that are in the area that he represents, but then also the whole nation. He also serves in his political party. And that's something that's unpopular to say sometimes, but it's definitely true in the sense that their party expects certain things out of them, but then also they need their party to be successful. We have political parties because that means that people can come together and that specifically that agree on certain topics, and they're able to work together if they're in the majority to make sure that what they need to pass is passed. So they do have to give and take some from their political party. So sometimes they don't always support everything that their political party needs them to. But if it becomes a major issue, their political party expects them to go with them. That way they can come together and have the majority that they need to pass legislation. And a final group that they have to balance the needs from, they are interest groups. Most frequently, these are called lobbyists. And there's lobbyists in Frankfurt. There's lobbyists in Washington, D.C., where Congress is. They represent interest groups. Typically, what happens is these people go and meet with legislators about topics as a way to improve our country or improve our state for the people they represent. Sometimes they're called in by legislators as a way to get more information on a topic. So there's a restaurant lobby, and the restaurant lobby goes through and advocates for people that own restaurants as a way to change the laws that impact their business. The largest lobbying group or interest group in this country is the AARP. They represent the retired people in the country. So people above a certain age that have joined their organization. It is the largest, like I said. And they go and advocate for issues that impact those people. One of the most well-known lobbying groups is the NRA, or the National Rifle Association. They argue on behalf of Second Amendment rights or gun legislation. So whenever they're looking at passing gun legislation in this country, the NRA is going to have their say about what's going on. Whenever there's an education issue, the National Education Association or the American Federation of Teachers is going to have their input into how that's being done too, or they're going to try to put their input. They're not always listened to. Same thing at the state level. There's several different groups that lobby in Frankfurt. The one that spends the most money in Frankfurt is the Kentucky Chamber. The chamber goes in and advocates for pro-business legislation. They represent the business community, different businesses around the state. So they want to go and make our state as business friendly as it can be, or they think that making it more business friendly creates more jobs, and that's what they argue for. Sometimes running contrary to those beliefs is the Kentucky Education Association, and it's one of the largest lobbying groups in Frankfurt as well. They go in and talk about education legislation and other legislation that impacts their group. The Kentucky Education Association represents teachers, educators, retired teachers, and a whole slew of different groups. So why does a group that advocates for business versus a group that advocates for education, why do they run contrary to each other? So you have to remember, money that governments have is finite, and it's also people's money. So any money that a government has, they've gotten that through taxes or other forms of taxes. So that means they are spending other people's money. So the amount that they have is finite, and they can only spend so much of it. Especially in Kentucky, where we have balanced budget amendments in the Constitution that requires them to balance a budget. So they can only spend what they bring in. With that being said, if there's only so much money, that means people are competing for that money. There's different budget lines. So sometimes colleges and universities run contrary to what we need here in K-12 schooling. So there's a lot of different factors at play, and it becomes very complicated. So as you're thinking about this, think about, in the event of a conflict. So if we're looking at local versus national needs, or a political party's needs, or their lobbying group that helps get them elected, who should they side with? Should they side with their constituents, or should they side with the national interests? And if you were representing a specific group of people, are you going to side with the people you're representing, or what's best for the whole group? What do you think should be their priorities when they're voting in Congress? So we've talked about this before when we were talking about the Constitution, but Congress is broken up into two houses. We call that a bicameral legislature. So there's the senators, and then there's the House of Representatives. Senators, there's two per state. They are elected by the entire state, so that means they focus on the interests of the whole state, and they're elected for 6-year terms. Their 6-year terms are staggered, though, so a third of them are elected every 2 years. That means that there's always experienced politicians in the Senate. And it was designed that way to make sure that there's some continuance in our government, that it's not always turning over every representative that we have in the state. The House is based on population. It's redone. Senate, the seats that they have are redone every 10 years after a census, which is why it's so important that you and your families fill out the census form that was mailed to you, or answer their questions when they come in and ask them to you, because these seats are reallocated based on the census. There's 435 seats total. A representative has an entire congressional district. So we live in the 6th congressional district of Kentucky. So we have Andy Barr as our representative, and he represents our the 6th congressional district. They are elected for 2 years, and the House reorganizes every 2 years. So every 2 years, every representative is up for election. And the minimum number of representatives the state can get is 1. So if they don't meet the population cap, they're guaranteed at least 1 representative in Congress or in the House. So they would get 3 in Congress because they would have 2 senators, 1 representative. So every state's guaranteed at least 3 people in the U.S. Congress. Kentucky has 6 representatives, which we've talked about the Electoral College some. Because we have 6 representatives, 2 senators, Kentucky gets 8 electoral votes in the Electoral College. So just a little bit of a side information there. The requirements, the salary benefits, all of those, it is required that they live in the state that's elected. That's going to become important in just a minute, so I'll talk about that again. Representatives must be 25 years old and a citizen of the country for 7 years. There's also specific residency requirements for their state, so maybe they are required to live in their state for 2 years before they're able to represent it. Whatever it is, states vary, so it could look differently for Kentucky than it does for West Virginia. Senators must be 30 years old, and they had to have been a citizen for 9 years. Same thing with representatives. There's certain residency requirements for the state as well. So they have to live in the state for so long before they're able to be elected to become a senator. The annual salary of a member of Congress is $174,000, and that was the 2014 rate. It might be a little more now. I don't expect it to be much higher. But while that seems like a lot of money, and it definitely is a lot of money to me or to most people in society, keep in mind they have to have 2 residences. So they have to keep an address in the state where that's elected them, but then they also have to keep a residence in D.C., or they want to keep a residence in D.C. That's not required, but they're there year round. So they need somewhere to be able to stay and actually have some resemblance of normal while they're there. So that takes a lot of money to be able to keep 2 full residences up. So it might not be actually what you think it is for them. Sometimes I will say our representative has stated before that when he first got elected to Congress, he had to sleep in his office because he just didn't have the stuff for a residence there yet. So they spent a few weeks sleeping in his office, and then finally he got a residence, and his family were able to come up with him. They also have allowances for travel, so they do get some money for traveling back and forth. Running offices, they do keep an office in their congressional district. If it's a senator, they maybe have multiple offices across the state. They do get staff salaries. Their work does take a lot of people. So not only just doing the business of helping write laws, but also the business of letting people contact you takes a lot. So they have people that answer phones, do what they need to be successful. But then they also get free use of the postal service. And this is only for specific congressional business. They can't send their political flyers this way, but they can mail surveys to their constituents and other tools that they need to be able to properly represent their constituents. There is powers given to Congress, and we've talked about this. They do have broad and some limited powers. And we're going to go through these 5 main powers on the next slide. If we're looking at what these powers are. So, one of them is promoting the general welfare. And what does that look like? Because that's very broad. They have further defined that as regulating or limiting commerce. So whatever that looks like, how they regulate business, collecting taxes and borrowing money. The power of the purse is one where they get the approval over any budget or any information. So they get to decide who gets money. That's not the president. They determine who spends money. They also get to provide. They also have the power of providing for general defense. They fund the Army and the Navy and all the military branches that we have. And they also have the sole power to declare war. The president runs the military. He's the commander-in-chief, and we'll talk about that a little later. But Congress is the one that provides for the funding for it. They also, like I said, sole power to declare war. So the president can send in troops, but they can't stay there until Congress declares war on a country. They also have the power to establish justice. So especially at the federal level, they approve judges. The Senate at least approves judges that are appointed by the president. The House has the power to impeach, and the Senate has the power to try impeachments. And this PowerPoint, as I'm looking at it, is now out of date. When it was created, only 2 presidents had been impeached, but none had been convicted. That should say 3 presidents have been impeached at this point. However, still none have been even convicted. Which President Trump was impeached at the beginning of the year, but he was not convicted in the Senate. They had their trial, and they did not find enough information to convict him. There's also specific unlisted powers in the Constitution. And what does that mean? How do they have a power that's not listed? So essentially, in the Constitution, they wrote in an elastic clause. And it says that Congress has the power to make laws necessary and proper for carrying out the powers. So that can look different. The necessary and proper clause is very broad. Who determines what's necessary and proper? And I will tell you, a lot of administrations and local governments do this as well. So if we look at our school, there's always phrases in there that says at the discretion of the principal, which means that things can change according to what Mr. Fritz thinks is appropriate. So while that is elastic, the Constitution itself does limit in the actual powers of Congress. So if we look in at the First Amendment with the freedom of speech, you're guaranteed an ability to voice your opinion, but how it looks can vary. So Congress can't regulate your opinion, but they can regulate sometimes how it's expressed, or that you're not doing it violently. So you have the right to peacefully assemble. So Congress can't regulate that, but they can sometimes say when it's appropriate or not. It just depends, and it varies based on what the Supreme Court rules is actually necessary and proper. They do have some non-legislative powers as well, and these are powers that don't deal directly with lawmaking. There's several different ones, like impeaching officials, confirming appointments, investigating, approving treaties, stuff like that, that isn't actually the process of making law, but it's still important for our representatives to do that in DC. There are some limits on the power of Congress. Like I said, one of the major limits is the Constitution. The Constitution is a limit on their authority that also outlines their authority, which means they don't have unlimited authority. So amendments there do limit what they're able to do. The president can also veto. So a veto is saying that a bill, he doesn't agree with it, shouldn't be a law. The Congress does have some recourse to a veto, and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to how a bill becomes a law. And then the Supreme Court could decide that a bill is not actually constitutional, and then that would invalidate the law. But then also Congress can't pass bills of attainder. which essentially would convict a person of a crime without a trial. So they can't come in and write a law and say, Mr. Presnell wore a hat on this day, and that was we don't like that he wore a hat, so we're going to put him in jail. There has to be some type of trial there. Congress does begin a new term every 2 years. So remember when we were talking about representatives and their terms? Every 2 years, the entire House is reorganized. So it's based on those 2 years. They do start in the odd years, and then within each of those, there's 2 sessions, so 1 session per year. House reorganizes every 2 years, however. Like I said, the Senate never completely reorganizes because only a third of them are ever up for election at the same time. Here is the leadership in the Congress right now. So you can see in the House, Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. She's the presiding officer. She sets the agenda. She sets what's voted on. She helps govern the majority party. And there's a majority leader. He's representing the House on the floor, or at least the majority party on the floor, while the minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, is representing the minority party. So Steny Hoyer is a Democrat. Kevin McCarthy is a Republican. Jim Clyburn is the majority whip, while Steve Scalise is the minority whip. Then if we look at the Senate side, the vice president is the president of the Senate. But the only authority he has actually in the Senate is to vote in the case of a tie. He doesn't actually have the authority to rule on anything else, only to vote in the case of a tie. The president pro temp is Orrin Hatch, and he's a senator that's put there by the majority party. And then the majority leader is Senator Mitch McConnell, who actually represents our state. He is a Republican. The majority whip is John Cornyn. Minority leader is Charles Schumer, and the minority whip is Dick Durbin. So that wraps it up. Make sure you go to assignment B just below this video on Google Classroom and fill out the quiz and get that submitted, and it'll get it graded into Google Classroom. Don't forget, if you have questions, you can join me for office hours from 9 to 10 tomorrow morning. Or if you have other questions and you can't wait until then, send me an email. I've been responding pretty quickly, or I try to respond pretty quickly, and I'll be understanding of whatever you need to go through. So I hope you all are doing well. If you need food or if you need some other assistance that I haven't talked about, feel free to shoot me an email and I'll get it taken care of. Have a good one.